We are recording.
All right, thanks a lot. Good evening, everybody. My name is Richard Klein. I'm president of the African American Historical Association, and we want to welcome you to our speaker series. And tonight we're privileged to have Dr. Emilie Amt, professor of history at Hood College, soon to be professor emeritus or emerita, depending on which one she chooses. And she's going to be doing her presentation on Ebenezer's Lost Cemetery. So it's all yours, Dr. Amt.
Side by side.
Thank you. I'm going to have to mute a few more people. Hang on there. I think we're okay now. Okay, so
I see that Jean Libby is actually joining us.
Welcome, Jean Libby. You are someone whose work has been such a benefit to us all. Well, thank you all for coming. And I can't see any of you, and I can't see myself. So hopefully this will work. And I'm going to be talking tonight about the lost cemetery at Ebenezer AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church in Hagerstown, Maryland. And I think everyone who's with us tonight has some familiarity, at least with where Hagerstown is. And the church that I'm talking about, and the first crisis is that my slides are not, there we go. The slides are advancing. The church that I'm talking about is in downtown Hagerstown, and it is a historically Black church. And today, the site that I'm talking about looks like this. In fact, it looked like this yesterday when I took this picture. So it is a very up-to-date photograph of the site, which was once the cemetery. And I'll talk more about how much of this site was the cemetery later as we go through the talk. So Ebenezer, or Bethel, as it was known, and it's been known by both of these names throughout its history, is one of the oldest African-American churches, not only in Hagerstown, but in America. One of the oldest AME churches, I should say. It is often said to have been founded in 1839, and you see that date here on this document, but it was actually founded in 1820. And the document you see on the screen here is from the record book of Ebenezer or Bethel, which is lodged in the Washington County Historical Society. And this is an early document, the Articles of Incorporation with the city, from 1839, but this record book cites, it quotes an earlier record book, earlier document, which shows very clearly in the second red circle at the bottom that this church was chartered by the National AME Church and by Richard Allen. And you can see his name here at the bottom of the document, by Richard Allen, the founder of the AME Church in the US. In 1820. So this is a very early AME church in American history. And Richard Allen helped charter it. And it existed in Hagerstown, and then it was incorporated in Hagerstown in 1839 by the Reverend Thomas Henry, whose memoirs, whose autobiography was so ably edited by Jean Libby, who's here with us tonight. And Thomas Henry was a very important Black leader in Hagerstown and Washington County, Frederick County, and the whole region. But this talk is not about him, but he'll come back into it a little bit. Bethel or AME or Ebenezer was located in the heart of Hagerstown and in the heart of what was already becoming the Black neighborhood of Hagerstown, the historically African-American neighborhood of Hagerstown, often called the Jonathan Street community. But this church was on Bethel Street. And this map from 1850 shows you the first two locations of the church. on Bethel Street, which I've labeled in red here. This is an 1850 map. The church, of course, is earlier. And the circle, the right-hand circle here, shows where the church was first located. It had one, possibly more buildings in that location. But the first building that we have visual records of is the one on this map where it says in the left-hand circle, African Meth, which is African Methodist Church. It's really an African Methodist Episcopal Church. Map makers were not always completely accurate in how they labeled Black churches in particular. And so this is Ebenezer or Bethel on Bethel Street, as it was located in 1850. And we can see a picture of this church in this photograph. This is the earliest known photograph of Ebenezer, and this is a building that was built in about 1840. And it is at least the second Ebenezer building. It's the one on this site here, the one circled at the here on this corner. And this brick building is the one that was in use during the Civil War. It's the one that Thomas Henry operated in and helped to build. It is the one that was used as a smallpox hospital during the Civil War, and where Jacob Wheaton served as a nurse, if you're familiar with him. This church was in use until about 1910. And this is the church that had the cemetery, that first had the cemetery. On this map from 1877, we see the church here. And here it's called Bethel. These names were used almost interchangeably. And we see a school that I am not going to talk about at all tonight. And we see it's a post-Civil War school. And we see the cemetery. This is the first, I think it's the first appearance of the cemetery on a map. It's not really important whether it's the first or not, because we know from other records approximately when the cemetery came into use. The earliest known burial in the cemetery that I have been able to find dates from 1843. And that works very well with a church being built for the first time on this corner in about 1840. So we have the church, we have the cemetery, and notice this oblong parcel of land. Here it's divided into two longer parcels. Later we'll see it divided this way into two square parcels. But this is the property of Ebenezer, and it will remain that way for a long time. And you see the cemetery is sort of located up here in the northern half, and the church down here in the lower, the southeast corner. So the cemetery, what documentation do we have from the cemetery? Well, we have some records that show people being buried there, but they're not records from Ebenezer. But we do have this wonderful document, which I was very excited to run across. This is pasted into the Ebenezer record book in the Washington County Historical Society. And it appears to be, I'm pretty sure it is, a plat showing, or a stylized plat, showing basically reservations or lots bought by people to be buried in the cemetery. I don't think it's a record of burials, but of sales of lots or reservations of lots in the cemetery for people who planned to be buried there. It is undated, but I would place it in about the 1840s with probably some later additions of names. And we see some notable names here up at the top. We see Thomas Henry. We actually see Thomas W. Henry. Maybe that's the son of the famous Reverend Thomas Henry. We see Samuel Nimmey, who is a very important member of the Black community in the Jonathan Street neighborhood. There are many other names that historians of this community would recognize. You see names that are very common in this area, If you're a Washington County historian or a resident, you will recognize the name Dorsey as a common local name. And then down here, I want to draw your attention to this name, Otho Snyder. It's Oth Snyder, but that's Otho Snyder. And Otho Snyder is really a hero of the Black community in this region in Hagerstown. Otho Snyder was an elder. He was a trustee of Ebenezer Church. He was also arrested multiple times for helping people escape from slavery in Washington County. He and his wife were both arrested for this. His wife, Margaret, was arrested at least on one occasion with him. And Otho Snyder was eventually sent to the state penitentiary for helping escaping slaves. So he is just someone who I think we should admire greatly. I don't think he was buried here because when he was eventually released, having served a term of, I think it was 6 years for helping people escape from slavery, he was required by law to leave the state of Maryland and not return. And as far as I can tell, he did. And so I haven't found any record of him coming back to Maryland. So I believe he died elsewhere.
Overworked border patrol agents. Terrorist is in Texas.
I think somebody needs to mute. I'm going to try and mute you if I can. Well, it sounds like they muted. Okay. So going on, we have also records of some people who were buried at Ebenezer. Aside from the document I just showed you, we have a list of the stones the gravestones that existed that survived until the 1930s. We have the stones that survived. We have a list made in the 1930s. We have a few other references in other records, not from Ebenezer, of people who were buried there. And so we know that, for example, Catherine Henry, the wife of Reverend Henry, was buried in the cemetery. Reverend Henry was buried at Ebenezer, but apparently in the church, and I will come back to that later. A deacon of the AME church, that is a traveling representative of the church of quite high rank, was visiting Hagerstown and died while he was here. And so his funeral was held here in Hagerstown in 1845, and he was buried in the cemetery. We have Thomas Henry's description of that event, although there was no stone for him that survived into the 30s. And then we have at least 5 veterans of the Civil War that are known to have been buried in the cemetery because their stones were found there in the 1930s. And they include 2 members of Moxley's band. If you're local, you may know about Moxley's band. They were a black band who played together before the Civil War and then signed up together and became the 1st Brigade Band in the U.S. Colored Troops. And then 3 other members of the U.S. Colored Troops who were buried in the cemetery. And these are the ones we know of because of their stones. Okay. Now, we have all these burials. There were probably hundreds of burials in this site, I would guess. But we only know of say, fewer than 100. But it was a very well-used cemetery. It was the main cemetery for the Jonathan Street community, the Black community in Hagerstown in general. And over time, it became very full, this cemetery. And by the 1890s, it was so full that it was becoming difficult to do burials in this cemetery. And it was also drawing attention from the neighbors. In 1893, there were reports of crowding of burials. And there were also complaints that there were many houses being built nearby and increasing value of real estate. the reports that I found in the newspapers do not say whether these complaints were coming from white neighbors or black neighbors, but I'm going to put my money on the white neighbors. So whenever we have black cemeteries coming under pressure from the neighborhood, we have to suspect that racism is an issue. In 1893, this issue went to the city officials, and the health officer condemned the cemetery, but gave the church a reasonable time to remove the dead. So they actually expected the dead to be removed from the cemetery, apparently. That didn't happen. Apparently it didn't happen, and burials continued. And so in 1897, we get the next record of more controversy surrounding the cemetery. And this time it goes to a city council meeting, and there's a lot of strong language being used, and people bringing their complaints to the city council. And the report, a very colorful report, is made to the city council of bodies being dug up accidentally during new burials, and the families are upset on both sides. The new burial, the people who need a new burial are upset that a body is coming out of the grave when they're expecting a funeral, and the people whose dead are being dug up, of course, are also upset. Well, the health officer, and this time is a different health officer from 4 years ago, condemned the cemetery, and this time he did it really strongly. He forbade further burials, and he also wrote to Ebenezer, to the church and the trustees of the cemetery, with a really rude letter, using very condescending language, very snarky language, and making almost jokes at their expense. It was really quite unpleasant letter. And so the cemetery was under condemnation, meaning it could no longer operate as a cemetery. At this point, however, Ebenezer had a new plan. There were members of the church who belonged to a fraternal order called the Good Samaritans and Daughters of Samaria. And it was very common in the late 19th century for people to belong to fraternal orders. Both white and black people belonged to many orders, like the Masons, the Odd Fellows, and so on. And this was an order called the Good Samaritans and Daughters of Samaria, a black fraternal order that had a lot of members who belonged to Ebenezer as well. And this order, the Samaritans, decided to address this problem of no longer having access to Ebenezer's cemetery for burial by purchasing another cemetery. And they decided to purchase an existing cemetery out in the countryside at Halfway. And for those of you who may not be familiar with Halfway, it is, though I think pretty much everybody here in this audience that I noticed is from around here, but Halfway is a little town or a place halfway between Hagerstown and Williamsport. The Halfway Cemetery is between 2 and 3 miles from Ebenezer. So it would still be practical if you had a funeral at Ebenezer or at one of the other black churches in Hagerstown to have a funeral procession out to Halfway. At this time, the Halfway Cemetery was in the countryside, but there was a little, settlement or there was a community out there. It was not a black community, but there was a black cemetery, and it had been operating since the 1840s at least. So it was about the same age, we think, as the Ebenezer Cemetery, possibly older. But it was informal. For everything I can see is that, everything I can find is that it indicates that the Samaritans just bought it from a local farmer, that it was on farmland. So they bought the cemetery at Halfway and they incorporated it as a cemetery. It was about 7 acres, the site at Halfway. And they made it into a going concern. They began to sell lots at Halfway, and Halfway then became a major burial place for the downtown Black community in Hagerstown, the Jonathan Street community. It did not become the only burial place, but it became a burial place for not only Ebenezer, but for Asbury, and as time went on, other Black churches in Hagerstown. And that's all I'm going to say about Halfway, pretty much. Although I could go on about Halfway for another hour, so don't get me started. We want to look at, more at Ebenezer, though, because its story is by no means finished. There was a cemetery sitting there, and it could no longer be used. The next year, in 1898, somebody wanted to bury a body there. Someone had died, and their family said, "We have a lot here. We paid for this lot. We want to have our relative buried here near us in town." And there was a whole new controversy about this. But the health department stood firm, and I guess the church also said, "Come on, brother, we have this nice cemetery at Halfway now." And that is the last I have found. The last time there was an actual burial at Ebenezer, or an attempt to bury someone at Ebenezer. I don't know if that succeeded. Instead, something quite surprising happened, at least surprising to me, happened in 1899. And that is, oops, this slide is just my slide. So what happened next? Wait, I've missed a slide out. Sorry. Okay. This is what happened. In 1899, the Hagerstown Mail reported that bodies were being moved. So we have this tiny little item. It's just one sentence long, and there's no context for it whatsoever. I was so shocked when I found this in the paper when I was doing my research. It says, "Dead," I don't know if you can read it, but it says, "Dead in Old Bethel Cemetery, colored, are being moved to Halfway." So that's in April of 1899. I found some photographs here to show you what this might have looked like. These are not from Hagerstown, but they are 19th century photographs of cemeteries being dug up and the coffins moved. In the 19th century, this was not an uncommon thing. From the time of the Civil War, people had become familiar with and skilled in the moving of bodies. And so it was something that could be done, and they were used to doing. I don't know why, since Ebenezer was now just, sort of disused, anybody would feel the need to move the bodies from there to Halfway. I can think of a couple of possible reasons. One is that the conditions were so bad at Ebenezer, and this was an attempt to make it better. Another, that there were graves that were open or bones coming to the surface, perhaps. Another might be that people wanted to move bodies because now they were sort of moving their family burial sites to Halfway. New burials had to be at Halfway, so they wanted the old burials moved there so the family could be all together. That's a possibility. So that's what happened. Also, it is possible that this is a plan rather than an action being reported, that the dead in Old Bethel Cemetery are being moved to Halfway next month, something like that, that may not actually have happened. But to me, this seems like a report of something that really is happening, that, the digging is happening and the wagons are rolling down the street, and that's why it's being reported in the paper. That's what I think. So we have that note in 1899, and then we don't hear anything about the cemetery for a while. In 1910, we get a big change on the site when the church was replaced. Now, this is a 1931 aerial view of the site. This is the first aerial photograph we get of the site, and it shows the new church that was built in 1910. It's on the same site, the same footprint as the old church. And you see the church here. It's much grander looking, but it's about the same size, except for this additional wing out here. But it's the same corner of the lot. It's the same footprint. This is the cemetery. And you can see some of the stones. See? Dots, little dot, white dots. Those are stones. About the same time, somebody put a fence around the cemetery and the church got sued for it. It was in 1910. And the church said, no, we didn't put the fence up. So-and-so put the fence up. It wasn't our fence. So, there was some, effort at tidying up the cemetery by somebody or fencing it off for some reason. I would just note this little alley that separates the two halves of the lot. This is an east-west cut through here. And that will be perhaps significant later on. In the 1930s, after this photo was taken, all of the graveyards, all the cemeteries in the county, all the identifiable ones, were surveyed by a man named Piper, to whom we are extremely grateful. And when he came to Ebenezer, he identified 68 stones, gravestones, and he listed their names and dates. So that is how we know something about who was buried in this cemetery. That's how we know most of what we know about who was buried here, the record that he made in the 30s. And for those of you interested in gravestones, all of the Piper Cemetery records are available online at Wilbur, the Western Maryland thingamabob. They're on digital Wilbur as opposed to old Wilbur. And they're also available in print in the Western Maryland room. Okay, now my camera and my other things are blocking my PowerPoint. I'm just gonna wobble away here for a moment. Okay, so the years ticked over and time passed and the cemetery became overgrown. And eventually the church decided that it wanted to use the land more for the community. It was no longer being used to bury the dead, and now it was going to be made into a recreational space, a park for the neighbors and the church members. So in 1949 to 50, there's a flurry of news items about the plans for the renovation of this ground into a park, and then some reports on what had happened and the opening of this park. The plan was that no bodies would be moved, and this is extremely important. There was never a plan to move the bodies, and indeed, no bodies were moved. And we have the pastor at the time, the Reverend Charles Walden, being quoted in the Hagerstown paper, one of the Hagerstown papers, no bodies are going to be moved. There was a plan for 2 mounds to be built or made in the cemetery, and for all the stones, the gravestones, to be gathered together to circle those 2 mounds. Then later, the church leaders were quoted in the paper as saying it would be impossible to find all the graves. We just couldn't possibly do that. And they were absolutely right. If we remember, this was a disturbed site. The graves had been, dug up and people reburied on top of other people. So, they would not have been able, and not all the graves were marked. There were only 68 stones. we know that there must have been many more burials than that. And I should just mention, it's very common in the 19th century for people to be buried without grave markers, extremely common in both Black and white cemeteries, or without stones at least. They could be buried with no marker, or with wooden markers, or with plain field stones. But certainly, not everybody had a carved headstone. So instead, once the park was complete, we get a report that all the grave markers have been collected in the center of the graveyard and arranged in a group, and that the gravestones of the veterans, including Civil and Spanish American War veterans, had been placed together. And later on, there's a oral report that I've read of a mound, of a person who had visited the cemetery before it was gone, who remembers seeing a mound. So I think in the end, they may have made just one mound. And there's one more piece of evidence for that we'll come to in a moment. So they had planned 2 mounds, but I think they maybe just made 1 mound, or maybe just 1 mound survived over the coming years. As time rolled on, and really not much time, but 13 years, 23 years. It says 13 here, but my math is wrong. So 23 years later, the church's priorities shifted again. And still thinking of the community, they were now thinking about the need for housing, not recreation, but housing, and how the cemetery land, or the land that church owned, could be put to better use for affordable housing for the community. And this was very much a part of the general trend in the country at the time, obviously. And so the church decided to sell part of its property to a corporation that it was, participating in as well in the planning, and to help with the development of the Bethel Gardens development, which stands on the site today. And many of you will be familiar with that, north of the church, but on what was cemetery ground. So as part of this planning process, the cemetery trustees had to go to court and petition the court for permission to sell the cemetery, because cemeteries are protected in certain ways by law. And the petition for the sale is really quite interesting reading. It makes a number of statements that are just completely incorrect historically. But I think that the trustees believed that they were correct. So one of those statements is that in 1948, all the remains were moved into a common grave. And if we look back at what happened in, 1949, 50, 48 was probably when they started planning this. There was no plan for the bodies to be removed. It would have been impossible to find the graves. Nobody had any thought of moving bodies into a common grave, but they made that mound and they moved the stones. And I think that 23 years later, people remembered the moving of the stones, or they talked to people who had seen that, or they saw the mound and they thought there was a common grave now. The petition also stated there are no living relations of any bodies interred in the cemetery. Now, I hope that you are all laughing at that statement. You know that if you take 100 people, a random 100 people, say the people buried in the cemetery who lived some time ago, and say none of them have any descendants today, that's a false statement. Of course there are relations of these people living today. I think what the petition, and that's because we all know about genealogy today, but in 1973, maybe they just weren't that alert to genealogy. I think this was before Roots, or just about the time of Roots. And I think that what they meant was, nobody in the neighborhood or nobody in the church is aware of any ancestor buried in the cemetery. I think that's probably what they meant. I think they made these statements in good faith. Also, these were convenient statements to make. So we'll see how that turned out in a moment, but I want you to feast your eyes on this amazing photograph that was taken by a reporter for the Hagerstown papers. And it is, as far as I'm aware, the only existing photograph of the Ebenezer Cemetery taken from the ground. So it's pretty amazing. And excuse me, we will line it up in a moment. Yes, here we go. You can't take that photograph today because this land that the photographer was standing on is now under Bethel Gardens. But if you look at these buildings here, this one with the pyramid roof, this one with the gable end, and this shed roof here, these garages here, you can see they still stand. This is the one with the pyramid roof, the gable roof, and the shed. But they're over here. The pyramid roof is there. The shed, the gable end is there, and these are the sheds, and they face Bethel Gardens now. So those gravestones, they were here. They were not here. They were here. So what happened? The petition included this plat. The petition to the court asking to sell that land to Bethel Gardens included this plat, which is the Ebenezer property. And fascinating to me, whereas before the church is here. When they submitted this plat, the church stood here. They just didn't draw in the church. Before, the word cemetery was all across here. Now, the cemetery is identified as this little piece in the red circle here, the little piece that is just about 40 feet by 50 feet. And that's the cemetery now. And I think that they're led into thinking that by the fact that that's where the mound was, and that's where most of the stones were, the gravestones. And so they said, here's this little cemetery. Here's this big parcel number 1 that we want to sell off. It's just a little cemetery. And the bodies are all in here. It'll be easy for us to move them. And so the state's attorney, reading the petition, duly authorized the removal of any human bodies, monuments, gravestones, or markers, and gave permission. So the Minnick Funeral Home was in charge of moving the remains. And in about the year 2000, Don Brown, a local historian, interviewed Gerald Minnick. And Gerald Minnick said that he had found a mound here with remains. And the mound was about 2 graves wide. I guess funeral directors describe things by how wide they are in terms of graves. 2 graves wide. It contained mostly rock, not very many bones. The Minnick staff placed these remains. They dug up the mound. They took out what bones they could find. They placed those bones in a concrete box. And they moved them to Rose Hill. The Minnick Funeral Home donated a space at Rose Hill Cemetery to receive those remains. Now, those of you who may not be familiar with Hagerstown, Rose Hill is the largest cemetery in Hagerstown. It is a general use cemetery. It has, it's integrated, well, it's sort of integrated. It has, if you can see the bottom of the screen, and what's called the old colored section down here next to Potomac Street. But that's not where these remains went, although sometimes people have been told that. The cement box was buried in section 7 in the north part of the cemetery, actually in 7A, near this fence, which separates the cemetery from the concrete blocks plant. Section 7 is where these Ebenezer remains were buried. Excuse me. And this burial was unmarked. There was no marker placed over the Ebenezer remains. In addition, no gravestones were moved from Rose Hill to Rose Hill from Ebenezer in 1974 when the remains were moved. And I have not been able to find any information about what happened to the gravestones, the, 68, I think, gravestones that should have been surviving at that point at Ebenezer. No trace, no trace. And when I say I haven't been able to find them, Don Brown did a lot of this detective work in the year, around the year 2000, about like interviewing Gerald Minnick and just tracing out what happened in 1974. And so he, really tried to track down the remains, and he did track down the remains and the gravestones, and just was unable to find out anything about the gravestones. He interviewed a lot of people, so kudos to him. So the site then had these had Bethel Gardens, which was built in 1974, and it had the church, this church. But some years later, in 1999, the church was found to be structurally unstable, and it was demolished. And thus we have this open green space today, from this square here to this square here. And Ebenezer today worships in this modern building here. That's the modern building. And then there's also this late 19th century parsonage attached to it. However, big story continues. I mean, the 1999 demolition was very interesting for the cemetery story, because when they tore down the big church, it was known as Big Bethel, in 1999, 2 bodies were found in the foundation or the basement. And I have not found very much information about this, but one was said to be the Reverend Thomas Henry, who had died in 1877. I don't know. I have not been able to find out why this body was said to be his. It is said that it was common for the pastor to be buried in the basement. I don't know how accurate that is. Both sets of remains were taken to Rose Hill and buried there, and they were buried near Section 7, but not in Section 7. They were buried in the section called Rock of Ages. Here is my photograph of the Rock of Ages section. And this is baffling to me. 2 gravestones were moved from Ebenezer to Rose Hill with them. I don't know where these gravestones came from. Were they in the basement of the church? Were all the gravestones in the basement of the church? Why were only 2 of them moved? These are gravestones from the cemetery. We know that from the records. They are children's gravestones. I'm shaking my head, or you can see me. I'm shaking my head. This is very confusing to me. So these 2 children's gravestones were taken to Rose Hill. They were laid flat in the turf. They are there today. The turf grows over them mostly, but you can find at least one of them. I have found at least one of them there. There you go. There are many mysteries here. One of the mysteries for me is, why are bodies from the 19th century being found in a 1910 church? Why? To me, this says that this 1910 church is built on the foundation of the 1840 church, or on the, using its basement, which is perfectly possible. I am not an architectural historian, so I'm not going to say any more about that. But if you look at the 2 buildings, you can see they have, the similar shape. They even have, similar 4 bays there, similar windows. I'm not going to say much more about that, but I think it's very interesting. Why were there 2 gravestones found in 1999? Why not more? Why not fewer? And do those two gravestones match the two bodies that were moved with them to Rose Hill? I don't know. Very mysterious and baffling and all kinds of interesting, but we can't solve that now. Also, I should admit at this point, I have not used any Ebenezer records that might be at Ebenezer for this talk because pandemic. And I apologize for that. So moving into our final phase here of the talk, I show you the site today. I apologize if you are colorblind. I know I'm not supposed to be using red here, but I did it anyway. So this is the site today, looking down from Google Maps, from Google Satellite. And you see here in red, if you can see red, Ebenezer, the ghosts of Ebenezer, the previous church was here. The previous two churches were right here. You can even see the outline of it in the grass. And then the previous cemetery was here. But I would guess, and I think that that aerial 1931 aerial view showed us that there were also gravestones down in this southern half of the site, maybe in here in what is now grass, maybe under what is now the worship building. So who knows? And this leads us to our concluding questions. Question: where are the dead of Ebenezer now? Where are they? And I have three answers. First, some of them, I believe, are at Halfway, at the Halfway African American Cemetery. So I'm bringing Halfway back in. I love Halfway. Halfway is one of my projects along with Elizabeth Paul, who may or may not be here tonight. She lives next door to it. We are leading a very wonderful group of volunteers. Jenny Ross is here tonight. She's one of them. She's an archaeologist. And we are trying to save and restore and preserve Halfway cemeteries. If you're interested in that, I'd be happy to talk to you more about it at the end of the talk. So I think some remains were moved from Ebenezer to Halfway, but that is a completely unknown number. It might have been 3 or 4. It might have been dozens or scores, just completely unknown. 2, Rose Hill. The story was the bodies from Ebenezer were moved to Rose Hill, but very few remains were moved from Ebenezer to Rose Hill. I think the work that Don Brown did in checking that story out is conclusive. The funeral director said, we found very few remains. And the history before that shows that there were very few to find where the Minnocks dug. I think the third answer is the obvious and disturbing one. They are still at Ebenezer. They are under Bethel Gardens. And of course, in the construction, the graves were destroyed and torn up. And they are perhaps also under this part, the part of this open space and the building now used for worship. It's possible that, and others would know better than me, it's possible that ground penetrating radar would show some of that, but I would remind you also that this was a disturbed site by multiple burials. So I don't know quite how that would interplay with ground penetrating radar. But I believe that the majority of Ebenezer's dead may still be at the site, probably are still at the site. And this, reminds us that so many African American cemeteries are, lost but still there, have been built over. In this case, for the best of reasons, that headline back earlier in the talk said, dead to make way for the living. And, in this case, that's what happened. The dead of this community made way for the living of this community. And that was a decision made by the community. So it's not, often we get stories of, white developers just going, bulldozing a cemetery that's been forgotten. And that isn't really what happened at Ebenezer, but it is still the loss of heritage, and to be, taken into consideration, I think, as we think about how we treat these sites in the future. I would like to thank, most of all, Mr. Don Brown, whose research around the year 2000 on all Black cemeteries in Washington County is available at the Western Maryland Room, and all of these other people who have done work that I've drawn on, or who have provided resources. And if you would like to know more about the Halfway Cemetery and help save it from further neglect and loss, and help restore it, we would welcome your help and interest. Now I'm going to try to figure out what I do next. Well, that didn't work. Maybe I stop sharing. Stop share. I think that's right.
There you go.
Okay. So, Rick, talk to me. What do I do next?
Well, I think we can open up to some questions if anybody's interested in asking any questions or any comments. I'll just it's not a huge group here, so jump on in.
And how I need to do something so I can see everybody. I need to figure out how I can, I know there's a place to see everyone. Now I can see everyone.
There we go.
If you don't have your camera on, you'll need to put it on or just yell, or you can use that little raise hand icon, or you can just talk. But you'll have to unmute yourself or ask to unmute. If I muted you, hi, Chuck.
I had a question.
Steve, hi. Oh, sorry, who had a question?
This is Monty.
Monty, hi.
I was noticing in the list of names that you showed for people who had possibly bought a plot in the original cemetery, it looked like Melinda James was one of the names there.
It was.
I was just interested to know, I'm sure you've been searching for her diligently. What have you learned about that, if anything?
She also occurs, I believe she occurs, I found that someone who I think is her and her husband and one of their children in, I think I'd have to check it, but I think they're getting their child baptized at Ebenezer at one point. The dates are right, and I think it's them. And if the audience will indulge us for a moment, today, I got her death certificate. So I will share those with you outside of this forum. But yeah, and I can send you that photographs of that document if you like, and also of the Melinda James page from where she and her husband are getting the child baptized. I'm sorry, that's very ungracious way to say, where they bring their child to Ebenezer for baptism, is what I should say. But yeah, I can share those records with you. Steve.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Were you aware that there was actually 2 other African-American cemeteries in that neighborhood?
I was aware of the Catholic one up by the railroad tracks, but other African-American ones, how close?
They were on North Prospect Street, where a dog legs there by the molar factory.
No.
I have some information at the office on it. If you want it, I can dig it out for you.
I'd be fascinated, please.
And part of our ordinance is to make sure that people don't dig up cemeteries in the city when they go through the development process. We have an inventory process
Mhm.
and certain protections in our land development ordinances. And we actually did an inventory of all the burial sites that we could find around the city a number of years ago. You're welcome to all that information as well, but it would be good to know. It sounds like you just made reference to another cemetery that I may, or depending on where it is, I may not have. So we're always looking for information on cemeteries that we may not be aware of that we can add to our inventory and list so they don't
Okay.
get dug up in the future.
Okay, let's talk by email, but it wouldn't, you aren't unaware of the halfway cemetery.
No, the halfway cemetery I knew of, but you made reference to a cemetery near a railroad track.
Oh, I might have that wrong. The Catholic one?
Okay, this would have been somewhat across the street from the Catholic cemetery. Catholic cemetery was on the west side of what's now Prospect Street. This cemetery was on the east side. And it was purchased by.
I'm not sure. I would have to look.
Okay, this one was purchased by, it was actually, I'm not sure if it was two cemeteries or one that got expanded with a second piece of property. It was bought by I believe Walter Harmon at one point, and developed for housing. So there's no real physical evidence of it there, but I haven't done any research on what happened to the remains or anything like that. So
That's great. Thank you.
Mhm.
Elizabeth, you're
Just,
muted. Right.
I know you are in Hagerstown, but what are there similar people doing this kind of research in Frederick that you can maybe have a Frederick? Do you know?
Well, in a way, Frederick has done some people have done some of this work in Frederick before this. So Frederick has a couple of lost cemeteries that have already sort of gone through this a reckoning process. There's the Laboring Sons Cemetery, which was basically stolen by the city and annihilated, but then after some decades was rediscovered and a park made and a process of recognition happened. And there's a documentary film about it, and there's a memorial and so on. And then there's also a cemetery under where there was a Black cemetery under where the hospital is now in Frederick. And every time they do major renovation of the hospital, they find some more bones. So although those burials were supposedly moved to, and some of them were, and the markers were moved to Fairview Cemetery out to the east of Frederick, when the hospital was, I think, first built, but maybe first expanded. It was only very recently, like maybe 5 years ago, maybe less, that the hospital decided to recognize that. And they made a memorial garden in a courtyard inside the hospital that recognizes that cemetery. So I know those are the two that I know of actually in Frederick City itself. Outside of Frederick, throughout the county arch, the African American Resources, Cultural and Heritage is a group, it's a sort of African American historical group that is very active in Frederick and Frederick County, and it does regular cleanup days. I think twice a year they pick an African American cemetery in the county and they go and do a cleanup day. So there's an eye being kept, unofficially, but helpfully being kept on the Black cemeteries in Frederick County. But there's no, I don't think there's any, there's no official group that is, a supervisor of Black cemeteries or lost cemeteries or anything like that, either here or in either county. And I don't know of a scholar of cemeteries in either county. I'm not a scholar of cemeteries. I had an interest in this one and Halfway because they're intertwined, and I'm working at Halfway particularly. And I just found this story so interesting. And so, there's Ebenezer and Halfway are sister cemeteries, really, or they're adopted sisters. They grew up independently, but then they got joined.
Thank you. Any idea the Civil War man that you said was buried there, that he was not transferred over to the Antietam National Cemetery?
Oh, no.
That's really sad, I think. Never mind.
Yeah, there are Black veterans buried all over the county, all over the county.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Halfway has half a dozen at least. Don't we, Elizabeth? And one of the things we're planning to do in a couple of weeks for Memorial Day is, for the first time since probably the 1930s, if then, and we don't know what they did before, but on this Memorial Day, we're going to put flags by the surviving stones of the veterans at Halfway.
Good.
So there's only 3 stones that we have at this point, but we'll put flags there to honor them. And we'll do something else too. But we're trying to restore that cemetery, and the first thing we want to do is honor those veterans. Jean, I want to ask Jean a question.
Yes.
Since we have you here, do you have any thoughts about the burial of Thomas? The first question, that background behind you, that isn't Ebenezer, is it?
It is.
Oh my goodness. Where did you
Yes.
get that photograph?
I took it when I was researching, and it would say it was taken in the early 1990s. And I have this fun little program that can put back as background, like a green screen,
Yeah,
your various media files.
yeah.
So I chose that for today. The lady whom you see on the stairs
Huh?
is Mrs. Dorothy Curlin, the wife of Reverend Leonard Curlin, who was then one of the ministers at Ebenezer. But I'd like very much to discuss further the burial of Reverend Thomas Henry. You found it, or they found it, in the foundation. Now, he died in 1877, and according to his obituary, he was buried under the altar. So, yes.
This is the question I really wanted to ask her, that I suddenly saw the church and thought, but yes, what do you think about this burial?
Yes, I believe that it was, as stated in his obituary, that he was traditionally buried under the altar as the founding minister. And I have really good reason to believe that as well, because I attend an 1863 Episcopal church here in California. It's the oldest continuous church in San Jose. And our founding minister was buried under the altar when he died the following year in 1864. And so it's, when people have said this, said, isn't this creepy? And I said, no, it's the way it happened.
It's very typical in medieval churches that important people were buried inside the church, and even up, near the high altar. So I don't find it under the altar is a little out there, but it's not that not that far from the medieval tradition. I'm a medieval historian, so
Yeah.
My
So-
frame of
so-
reference is always medieval. But
Yes.
thank you. I had not gone back to, I should have, but I did not go back to look at what the text said about his burial. So thank you for reminding us of that.
And I had a conversation with Mrs. Dolman in the 1970s, and she told me that she knew where the gravestones were.
And did she tell you where they were?
No, she just told me that she knew. And so I think that's something that, that all of you can pursue with
So-
with her family and in her records, because we talked about that and about the son Thomas E.W. Henry. That certainly stands for Edward Waters, just as the W in Reverend Thomas W. Henry is for Wesley. He named himself as well as
Yeah.
for his children.
So do you have any idea whether, because you say 1970s, it would be after the 1974, raising of the cemetery?
Yes, I was there in 1978 and 1979.
Okay. Well, that's
And-
encouraging because it means that the stones weren't just bulldozed into the foundations of Bethel Gardens.
At least she had a record of them, of who the names are.
Right. Well, the record also exists in the Piper records, and that might be the record she had.
Yes.
So she was good at digging up what records existed elsewhere.
Yes.
Steve. You're muted, Steve.
How about now?
Good.
If you have records with the obituary that he was buried in the foundation of the church, and the new church was built essentially on the shape of the previous church, and then the other commentary was that he was buried under the altar, which means he was kind of probably centered on the building somewhere. They probably built around him. My guess is that one of those two bodies that came out of there when they demolished the building, logic tells me, is Reverend Henry. I mean,
Yeah.
you probably can't prove it, but it seems to me,
Yeah.
I would say you probably got about a 95% chance that that's him.
I agree.
I do too.
And
if
they
that's the
probably
case-
knew it because of it being under the altar.
And if that's the case, then I think something ought to be done down at Rose Hill to mark him, because he's a very significant figure.
I agree. Yeah. Yeah. That's an excellent point. I mean, I agree as if I was thinking that. I had not thought of that, but that's a really good point.
I'll talk to my contact down there.
It's odd about the two stones that were taken there, though, because those two stones are for two entirely different people. Neither one of them is for Reverend Henry. So did they find three bodies? Why would they say this is Reverend Henry and then put him under somebody else's stone?
A lot of times, stuff like that, there wasn't a whole lot of logic in how
Yeah.
it was handled.
Yeah.
And who has a tombstone that is more typical of being erected outdoors inside the basement of a church, sticking up out of the ground? I'm interested in going down and looking and seeing these two stones, because
Yeah.
what that tells, what I think I'm going to find are stones that I think that were probably outside, that got found for some reason or another, when the ground was disrupted in the demolition process, and they just moved them down there with it
Yeah.
because they needed to do something with it.
Yeah.
But I just find it hard to believe there would be, and I haven't seen these stones. I want to go down to the cemetery and see them. But typical outdoor upright stones in the basement of a building, that sounds a little odd to me.
It is. That's what I said. This is just extremely confusing. So Steve, tomorrow I will send you the information from the Don Brown files about his, when he went to find these stones and what he had on them. So it will help you find them. And
Okay.
I had help from the office at Rose Hill when I found one of them, but the grass was very grown over it. So, and it was a couple of years ago. So you're going to need a little help finding them, but they're in the Rock of Ages section.
Okay, I'll check with Colleen.
It's, yeah. Well, any other?
I have one more question, if there's time for a second from me.
Absolutely.
You know, as a person who grew up in Hagerstown, you know, I associate Rose Hill Cemetery with the Confederate burial
Mm.
that's done there, that's so kind of similarly laid out to Gettysburg. I was just wondering, you know, at the time that bodies were being moved from Ebenezer to Rose Hill, was there any discussion, you know, in the community about that, or is that just something that sticks out more to me now, you know, than it did to people at that point in time? Or maybe it only sticks out to me. It's never stuck out to other people that's a kind of a strange pairing.
Yeah. So when you say discussion in the community, do you mean in the Black community?
Yes.
Yeah, I have no idea. So the notes, the evidence I have about what was happening in 1974 does not say anything about who decided the remains would go to Rose Hill. And also in 1999. I think I would guess that because there was a belief that that other remains, that a lot of remains had gone in 1974 to Rose Hill, that it was the right, you know, the natural thing for them to continue in 1999 to send the last two to Rose Hill. I will also say that there are a lot of Black burials at Rose Hill. As I've gone in my research on Halfway, I've been looking at African-American obituaries in the local paper. And because that's a good way to find people who are buried at Halfway, just to read their obituaries and burial at Halfway. But the African-American community throughout the late 19th and early 20th century buried its dead all over the county. And Rose Hill is a popular interment place for African-American families. So it was, people did not, as far as I mean, there may have been the occasional family that said, it's got Confederates there, we're not burying Aunt Rose there. But that does not seem to have affected many people, because there's a lot of Black burials at Rose Hill. And indeed, there is what is called the Old Colored section at Rose Hill. The African-American burials are not scattered throughout Rose Hill. They are in sections. It is a segregated cemetery within itself. That is common in cemeteries of the 19th and early 20th centuries. If they have multiple races in them, they have a white section, or they have the white cemetery, and then they have a Black section.
If I could add a little bit on that.
Sure.
Rose Hill, when it was established, there was nothing written into their records that prevented African Americans from being buried there. There was a section. It's the area, if you're heading down Potomac Street, out of town, before you get to the Confederate Cemetery, the area that you get to just before it, that was one of the primary areas. And in there is Jacob Wheat. Right. He's right up against the fence. About 5 years ago, his tombstone was leaning over. We arranged to have a new foundation put under it and cleaned up. There's also, again, that section in the back where the 1974 burials are. I've walked through there. I've recognized names.
Yes.
of people who I knew to be part of the African
Yeah,
American
I have
community.
too. Yeah. Yes,
And also, I think there are some individuals scattered around the cemetery. I found the burial site in Rose Hill of a USCT veteran who died in 1900. And we tracked down his burial site. And as far as I know, it's not a black section of the cemetery that he's in. How he ended up in that particular location, I don't know the story. He died in 1900. He was about 85 years old. He was actually pretty middle-aged when he was in the Civil War. And if you go in, and we had he was in an unmarked spot, and we had a VA stone put in for him. And you can visit that if you go in the main gate of Rose Hill and you drive past the little parking lot that's there on the left, and you have like a four-way intersection. Go straight through the intersections, go up the hill a little bit, and you'll see a new veteran stone on your right a little bit. That's where Mark Marshall is buried, of these. I think it was the 2nd U.S. CT Infantry.
nice.
But I think there are, I don't think it's, there's nothing is absolute and stuff like this. There were minority sections of the cemetery, but I think there was also some individuals that were buried also amongst the general population. And there was one other thing I wanted to mention as well, but it fell out of my head right now. So.
Okay, Rick.
All right, I think we're good. Yeah,
And
I
want
just want to
be-
thank.
Wait,
um,
somebody has a, Elizabeth?
Yeah, this
Go ahead.
is, I'm sorry, this is not to do, it just reminded me of Charleston, South Carolina. And we moved there in 77 anyway. And I was looking for a Quaker meeting. And the Quakers were there in as early as 1632. The first Quakers went to Charleston. They eventually built a small church, or actually like a house, had a cemetery. And however, in 1832, they left, the Quakers, because things were getting very, very restless in the South about slaves. And 1832 is when England said no more slaves being sold. Anyway, so they left and moved to 1977. I moved to Charleston and looked for a Quaker meeting and find out that the cemetery and where the house was all removed. The bodies were removed. They weren't even put in another cemetery. They were put between the courthouse and another house, literally in a bed of grass. And then the city decided they had to go to Philadelphia. But anyway, Philadelphia sold the city the lot for very little money. And the city built a 3-story parking garage in Charleston onto that lot. So we do a lot with cemeteries and with the people that were buried there. And historically, that certainly was important, that the Quakers, because many of them already were very much anti-slavery. That was just a sideline, Emily, sorry.
That's okay. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Hey, Emily, I remembered that last thing I wanted to mention is when it comes to folks being buried kind of all around the county and in various locations, I think one thing to take into consideration too is that Rose Hill from its inception is a commercial venture. You bought lots there, and cemetery lots, probably adjusted for inflation in the economy, probably is about as expensive now as they were then. So as a result, what you probably find is that the members of the African-American community who ended up in Rose Hill, by and large, are your more affluent African-American community,
Yeah,
because it costs money to be buried in Rose Hill.
right. Good point.
All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. Especially want to thank Emily for her presentation. This has been recorded and I'll post that on Facebook as well if anybody wants to see it later on. So thank you very much, and hopefully see you back at one of our other talks.
Thank you, Rick.
Great.
Yep,
Everybody
have a good
for
night.
coming.
Thank you.
Wonderful
Take care.
presentation, Emily. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.